Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We want to begin by acknowledging the Lenape people whose land Columbia University, our home institution, occupies. As a result of ongoing settler colonialism and a history of genocide and forced displacement, today the Lenape diaspora is dispersed throughout the US and Canada. We recognize that memorials and acknowledgements cannot stand in for the process of restoring native sovereignty. We furthermore recognize that the theft and enslavement of African peoples has enabled the material infrastructure of the university life that we are partaking in today. Howie and I are graduate workers at Columbia. We thought hard about whether to postpone this conference when we learned a few days ago that we would be going on strike this week. We are both on strike from our graduate worker labor, and yet we decided not to postpone the event again, and we stand in solidarity with our fellow graduate workers who are on strike for a fair contract as we speak. For those of you who have been eyeing this conference or who have been part of this event since we started circulating the call for papers a few years back, thank you for your patience and for sticking with us. As some of you may know, we, Howie Taylor and myself, Anna Shirey, are PhD candidates in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. And along with the support of Dr. David Scott, we are the two organizers of this webinar series. This event was supposed to take place in person last spring in the form of a two-day workshop. And we all know way too well why that didn't happen. But so we are very excited about this restructured format, and we are relieved that despite all the odds, and although some fantastic speakers have had to pull out, that this is going ahead. We want to begin by giving a heartfelt thank you to our sponsors. At the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center, these individuals include Kay Jang, Tess Shalifur-Draman, Lindsay Schramm, Eileen Galuli, and Sean Box. At the Institute for Social and Economic Research Policy, ISERP, they include Harlow Wang. Thank you also to our home Department of Anthropology, and especially to Jeannie Roche and Renee Tenenbaum. Finally, thank you to Dr. Scott for supporting our work. Multiple international efforts to redress the history of colonialism and enslavement alongside ongoing systemic forms of anti-Blackness, native dispossession, and imperial domination today exist. A number of these efforts are articulated in the language of reparations. These efforts emanate from various places, such as multi-state regional institutions, national governments, grassroots organizers, and smaller informal collective networks. Demands for redress articulated through a concept of reparations are imbued with various meanings. They occur at multiple scales, and they are addressed to a number of different recipients. For all, there is a demand for a material response, a response that is very often not given. This webinar series sets out to investigate demands for redress that articulate themselves explicitly through the language of reparations for slavery and colonialism. This broad scope allows for limitless questioning. In our call for papers, we posed a broad set of questions such as, what is the link between reparatory justice and broader movements for liberation or abolition? What is the relationship between reparations and repair? What does material redress look like? And what might the role of courts and international organizations be or not be in achieving such redress? We have invited a set of speakers who can guide us through these kinds of questions surrounding reparatory justice and the kinds of politics that it indexes. The presenters all speak to the international dimension of demands for reparations, and many of them speak to the centrality of the Caribbean to contemporary languages of Black reparatory worldmaking in particular. The question of the relationship between reparations in the context of the Caribbean, the wider Black Atlantic, and other struggles for redress may orient the kind of discussions that we imagine will be had here today. Howie, over to you.
Thank you, Anna. So thank you all for being here. The presenters in this webinar series come from different disciplines: legal scholars, anthropologists, psychologists, geographers, philosophers, and historians. This configuration poses challenges, but it also presents an opportunity to discuss topics across fields that place scholarly and political demands upon all of us. COVID-19 and difficulties with scheduling has meant that some speakers have had to pull out. We want to name those speakers. They were Keenan van der Meerup, Chelsea Val, Kevon Riney, Alexandria Smith, Evolush Koto-Quijano, Christopher Murray, and Amanda Porter. Their talks ranged from discussions of Métis land-back movements to debates concerning reparations for slavery in France, to the question of reparations for the forced removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children in Australia. We hope that we will be able to engage with their work in other forms in the near future. The webinar series will take place in the form of 6 panels, 2 each week over the course of 3 weeks, on Mondays and Wednesdays between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. EST, so that's New York time. You are all welcome to join for each session, and you are welcome to join for just a few. So we are super excited that Dr. David Scott will be sharing a few opening remarks for the session today. Broadly concerned with rethinking the story of the colonial past for the post-colonial present, David's work has dealt extensively with questions around intergenerationality, temporality, and the morality and politics of reparatory justice. We are very sure that David would have many questions for an event such as this one: the format, the title, the composition. He is the chair of the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University and the author of Formations of Ritual, Refashioning Futures, Conscripts of Modernity, Omens of Adversity, and Stuart Hall's Voice, Intimation of an Ethics of Receptive Generosity. Scott is the founder and editor of the journal Small Axe, the director of the Small Axe Project, and the lead curator of the 2021 Kingston Biennial. He is currently completing a book tentatively titled Irreparable Evil, New World Slavery and Moral History, and he is working on a biography of Stuart Hall. Thank you for being here today, David, and we look forward to hearing some of your thoughts. So over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Howie, for those remarks, and wonderful to hear your remarks as well, Anna. And I would also like to add my welcome to all of the participants of what is certain to be a remarkable set of conversations around the question of the possibility and impossibility of reparations. I would particularly like to congratulate Anna and Howie for conceiving and organizing this occasion in circumstances that are incredibly challenging. Anna and Howie are 2 very inspiring students from whom I have always learned a great deal and continue to learn, and to learn how to learn. And so I'm very grateful to them. I only have 10 minutes, which is undoubtedly more than enough time for me. In fact, all I want to do here is to reflect briefly on some salient features of what I have been calling a moral and reparatory history. I want to consider that this symposium is part of a larger endeavor that includes, if I may, the respective dissertations that Howie and Anna are writing, the endeavor that is to rethink the historicity that a moral and reparatory history suggests to us. To begin with, I take reparatory history to be that dimension of moral history concerned with past evils, in particular past atrocities, that remain unrepaired in the present. On this view, a reparatory history is a history of the present of such past evils, constructed in such a way as to illuminate what the present owes that past. A reparatory history then is concerned with moral debt. I share the view held by many liberal theorists of reparatory and restorative justice that past injustice triggers obligations to make amends, to right past wrong. Where wrong has been committed, a moral debt is incurred. And repair is due, simply. And I agree too that it is an elementary principle of reparatory justice that historical wrongs admit of no statute of limitations. They do not fade with the passing of time. They cannot be superseded by circumstances. Unrepaired wrong remains wrong still. More than this, such evils do not merely remain the wrongs that they were when they were originally committed. Evils are not simply dormant when they go unrectified, nor are the claims that derive from the obligation to repair their original occurrence. Rather, these claims in both moral and material senses ramify precisely in virtue of the fact that they have gone unrepaired. The non-repair of wrong is itself a wrong and both perpetuates and exacerbates the prior wrong. But where I part ways with liberal reparatory and restorative thinking is in its relentlessly forward-looking or reconciliatory approach to the harms of past wrong or past injustice. I do not share the progressive view that the supposed repair of moral relations between conflicting parties should always take priority over all other considerations. In my view, there are grave wrongs in respect of which reconciliation cannot be assumed to be either possible or desirable. Such wrongs, evils, I call irreparable. This is the starting point of my concern with reparatory history, a rejection of the assumption that repair is always the telos. In my view, irreparability is not a mere desideratum of reparatory thinking. Irreparability is one of its central categories. Reparatory histories register the generative trace of injustice that is not, in fact, past, but that haunts the present. I obviously do not mean to suggest that there are some histories in respect of which the past is safely and securely in the past, over and done with, without trace in the present. I mean rather to evoke the moral, psychological, and perhaps psychoanalytic sense of pasts that are collectively and individually unresolved or unreconciled in the present. And here again, I'm referring not merely to histories shaped, as all histories in some sense presumably are, by social conflict and political struggle, but histories pervasively and perhaps permanently unsettled by a ceaselessly troubled past that lingers, that lives on in an encumbering and burdensome way in the present. Further, and perhaps crucially, reparatory history points not only to pasts that have not been resolved or reconciled, but to pasts that are positively disavowed by those who either perpetrated the historical wrong or who are its contemporary heirs and beneficiaries. These disowned pasts are pasts for which no responsibility is acknowledged or accepted, in which innocence is claimed or assumed, and for which, therefore, there has been no public, sometimes no private accounting or reckoning. It is important to stress then that from my perspective, a reparatory history is expressly not a progressivist history. Indeed, although a good deal of reparatory thinking aims to breathe new life into versions of moral progressivism. To my mind, part of the significance of a moral and reparatory history is precisely that it emerges in the context of the exhaustion of progressivist history to confidently point a future beyond the present. The sense of reparatory history I wish to commend does not presuppose moral improvement. It is not compensatory. It need offer no balm of restitution. It does not aim to constitute for itself a consoling rhythm of futurity that redeems the past. To the contrary, what such a sense of reparatory history tries to do is to attune itself to the discomforting thought that some loss or damage or injury or failure can, alas, be permanent, that is, irreparable, in the appalling sense meant by George Steiner when he observed acutely that, quote, Oedipus does not get his eyes back. I believe that it is realism to recognize that not all evil pasts can give rise to happy futures. Some ruptured pasts cannot be put back together again. As I think of it then, reparatory history embodies this paradox. It is a history of unrepaired injustice that calls out for just repair, but it includes the idea that some pasts are in fact irreparable, the idea that the evil wrong that produced them in the first place was such that not only can it not be undone, because the tape of time cannot be unwound or rewound, but also it cannot any longer be repaired. It includes the idea that where some evils are concerned, we may not even be able to articulate fully what such repair might or even should look like or entail, which is not to say, I want to underline, that we ought not to commit ourselves to rethinking reparatively the moral history of what is irreparable. To the contrary, moral wrongs demand moral and political response, even when they cannot be repaired. Let me leave you with those reflections and hand it back to Howie and Anna. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you so much, David. Those were really powerful words, and I'm sure we'll be talking about them throughout the series. So we are really excited that two extraordinary scholars have agreed to be what we have called keynotes in conversation for the first session of this webinar series. And they are Dr. Catherine Frankie and Dr. Jovan Scott-Lewis. They come from different scholarly backgrounds and possess different orientations towards their understanding of reparatory justice. And by putting them in conversation, we foresee a fruitful discussion that can touch upon the somewhat ambitious title of our workshop. So firstly, to introduce Dr. Catherine Frankie, who is the James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia University, where she also directs the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law and is the faculty director of the Law, Rights and Religion Project. Dr. Frankie is a member of the Executive Committee for the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality and the Center for Palestine Studies. She is the author of Wedlocked, The Perils of Marriage Equality, published in 2015, and her most recent book, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition, published in 2019, makes the case for racial reparations today by telling the story of experiments in South Carolina and Mississippi in the 1860s, where freed people were given land explicitly as reparation for enslavement and then had it taken away by the government. Thank you for being here, Dr. Our other keynote in conversation is Jovan Scott-Lewis, Assistant Professor of Geography and African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His research is broadly concerned with the concepts of the market, capital, poverty, race, and post-coloniality, which he examines through raced experiences of the economy. Dr. Scott-Lewis is the author of the book Scammers Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica, published last year, which considers the function of capital, value, and reciprocity through the Jamaican lottery scam, a money transfer scheme that targets white North Americans to think about relations of capital and Blackness in the overlapping wakes of colonial independence and structural adjustment. He is currently working on a new book manuscript on questions of repair and reparations in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are honored that Dr. Frankie and Dr. Scott Lewis have agreed to be in conversation today, and we are happy to offer them the floor. Just before I do, I want to let you all know that the event is structured as follows. So first, Dr. Frankie will introduce her work for about 15 minutes. Then Dr. Scott Lewis will introduce his work. A conversation between the two will follow. And after this, there will be a Q&A with the audience. And we want to remind people that you can already send your questions in the Q&A at any point from now, and we will get to as many as possible when we open the floor. So, Dr. Frankie, I will hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Howie. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for setting this up so beautifully and giving us a frame within which to think about forms of repair. I also just want to reflect and acknowledge what Anna and Howie both mentioned earlier, the graduate student strike that's going on at Columbia. I wasn't sure if we were going to meet today. I know of another conference, the Beyond the Bars conference, that was just canceled last night because of the strike. And so it's with some discomfort, but assurance that I am not crossing a picket line, that I'm appearing here today, or at least virtually crossing a picket line. I do want to acknowledge the incredible work that Howie and Anna and other graduate students at the Heyman Center have been doing in an undercompensated fashion. So hopefully the university will rise to this moment and negotiate in good faith. I'd like to just share some slides with you as I talk and find them. Just 1 second. Find them here and go to the start. Apologies. There we go. As we think today about modern demands, contemporary demands that are placed on us from history for reparations in a range of contexts, and the context we're talking about today largely have to do with phenomenal events of white supremacist violence in history, a range of geographies. I do want us to think about 3 questions, in many ways primed by the questions that Dr. Scott set up at the beginning of the discussion just now. The first is, what kinds of moral demands does the past make on us today? Particularly with respect to the institution of slavery. And how do we find those moral demands? How do we recognize them? What kind of rule of recognition might we use to appeal to or to be summoned by those moral demands from the past? The second question is, how do we appreciate the ways in which the relegation or the delegation of slavery as to an event in the past does the work of exonerating white people in the present? What are the modes through which that past is locked away from us in a history? And what work does that do in the present? And I think the history of the Sea Islands in Mississippi are excellent examples of that exonerating effect of locking slavery into the past. The third question is, to what extent there is any necessary relationship between emancipation on the one hand and freedom on the other. And Repair, the book that I've written on this topic that Howie so nicely introduced, proposes the idea that there actually is no necessary relationship between emancipation and freedom. To be freed is not necessarily to be free, and that these are actually two very different conditions. The formal ending of the institution of slavery through the 13th Amendment in the United States and the idea of Black freedom itself are two very different events. And so in that sense, reparations are part of an accounting for that gap between being freed and being free, and I think are necessary, or a necessary component or condition of Black freedom itself. And it's why in so many ways we're still talking about these issues today. So as we talk about reparations, particularly in the US context, I always feel compelled to bring the people about whom we're speaking into the room. This is a group, an extended family in the Sea Islands of South Carolina in 1861. The day before this photograph was taken, Northern military troops arrived in the Sea Islands, and by their very presence, by their occupation of this land, rendered these people free. So as the white Northern troops arrived, the white enslavers fled to the mainland, leaving the people they had enslaved and leaving them in the custody of white military officials. And you could see here, this is not a group of people without agency. These are not fierce people. These are not strong people. I find this photograph extremely powerful, of people standing on ground where their families, their ancestors have been buried, but standing resolutely in a new condition of slavery, of freedom. Only one day after the Northern military arrived and through that occupation freed them. One of the first things that happened upon the Northern military officials arriving was a conversation that they initiated with the formerly enslaved people. What do you want? What happens now? And in many respects, the Northern government was hoping to conscript freed people into continued production of cotton in order to finance the Northern military effort. But these people wanted none of that. What they wanted was land, and what they wanted was for the white people to go away. For them, what was most important was a kind of backward-looking and forward-looking form of reparations that they articulated themselves to the Northern military officials, and they listened. And so we have General Rufus Saxton, who was charged with the project of ministering to the humanitarian project of, at least in his view, stewarding this community of people from the status of enslaved to emancipated. And he understood, he listened, he understood that there had been a kind of mortgage placed on the land and the crops of this community, held in trust essentially for the formerly enslaved people as a condition of what needed to be delivered to them in freedom. He understood, after listening to them, that this was both a backward-looking form of repair for the degradation, the violence, the murder, the rape, the family separation that was enslavement, never mind unpaid wages, but also a forward-looking obligation that you couldn't just emancipate a group of people who had no resources into a condition of abject poverty and call that freedom. Something more had to be done to make freedom possible. And to not do that was to render this group of people merely freed and not free. And what they said to him, and this is a quote from one of the gentlemen standing there in that earlier photograph, is, "What is the use of giving us freedom if we have no place of our own?" And the place they wanted was this land at the Sea Islands that had been evacuated by the former white owners upon the Northern military arriving. And so Saxton began to put this form of reparations into place. He got the federal government to agree that they would seize all of this land that had been owned by white Confederates, white Confederate enslavers, and that land would be divided and divided up into large lots, not just 40-acre lots, but larger lots, and given to the people, the newly emancipated people of the Sea Islands as that backward-looking and forward-looking form of repair. And so he began a process of issuing title to the formerly enslaved people of the Sea Islands. And you can see here, this is the Fripp plantation, in which the title wasn't given merely to nuclear families, but to larger community and kinship networks, people who had lived together as community, as larger extended family while enslaved, continued to see themselves as family and understood a future collectively. So here we see the marks of the people to whom this land was given and title was given. Of course, they could not write their own names because it was a crime to teach Black people to read or write at that time. And so their names were marked with the mere X. And I have to say, as I went through these documents at the National Archives, opening up many of these titles for the first time since the 1860s, it was incredibly moving to see where a shaking hand may have been stained with ink and smudged an X, where people chose their own, and just go ahead, this one, chose distinguishing marks as their own sign. These were the first acts, not just of freedom, but acts as people, as human beings, that the freed people of the Sea Islands undertook. And so these titles to land that were the warrant of a new kind of freedom in the Sea Islands for Black people are incredibly important testimony to what that meant to them and what a kind of future they might plot at that moment could be. And I just want to go back to this. So often what the people would do was also draw the plots themselves and then split up that plot among people in their kinship group. And they would use geographic signs, not regular rectangles, to mark off this land. So we have the pasture field, the burying ground camp, the Blackhorn Creek here. And you see these individuals laying claim, getting title to this land. And I just want to note that Mary Brown here and Nancy Wilson, two Black formerly enslaved women in this community in the Sea Islands, the Pleasant Point Plantation, what had been known as the Pleasant Point Plantation, were, as Black women, getting rights to own property that were not available to white women at this time. According to the laws of South Carolina and many, many states at the time, women could not own property in their own name. They were legally subsumed under the identity of their husbands. But these Black women were getting land titles that the federal government was delivering over, preempting in a way, the local state laws that prohibited women from owning land. So it's actually quite incredible that this is happening through this process of reparations as well. It has both a surely racial, but also gendered component to it. So here we have the Pleasant Point Plantation divided up into this beautiful sort of bean-shaped property, and that, again, evidence of the unsteady hand of those signing. And again, there are really interesting marks. Now, at the same time that this is going on, the Homestead Act is signed by President Lincoln, and 1.5 million families, all of them white, were given title to land in the West if they sat on the land and developed it for 5 years and paid an $18 fee. 246 million acres, about a tenth of the size of the United States, were allocated basically for free, $18, to white people in order to settle the West at the same time that this reparations project was going on in the US South. Sea Islands and in Mississippi to provide some kind of repair to formerly enslaved people. President Lincoln is assassinated, as you know. At the end of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and one of the first things he does is seize that land from the people, the freed people of the Sea Islands, and return it to their former owners. It was a condition of having the Confederates rejoin the national government, is that they would receive all of their property back except enslaved people. So all that land was violently returned to the former enslavers. And then the federal government issued a rule that the Black people in those communities had to sign one-year labor contracts with the people who had formerly enslaved them. That's what it looked like to be freed, but not free. And meanwhile, we're developing the West and making enormous land grants to white people at a time when we're seizing much smaller land grants from formerly enslaved people whose enslavement created a moral demand quite different from the people in these sorts of situations. So it's this failure to deliver a meaningful material possibility for Black freedom at the end of enslavement that we are bearing the legacy of today still. The racial wealth divide, the racial wealth gap bears witness to the intergenerational problem of locking Black people into a permanent state of peasantry, dependence upon white people, and an incapacity to develop wealth within the Black community or Black families themselves. It is real estate that has been the largest driver of wealth nationally in the United States, and Black people never got in on that deal in the same way that white people did, either through the Homestead Act or for policies that followed later that were blatantly racist, federal official legal policies that were blatantly racist. So let me just leave you with the Pleasant Point plantation today. Remember that picture with the sort of oval-shaped property that freed people got titled to. This is what it is now. It is a gated, all-white senior community. They have a lovely golf course. It's a lovely place to live. But on their website, there's a little story about their history that makes no mention of the fact that this actually was a plantation, that people were enslaved here, that the people who enslaved them fled, that the land was then seized and title was given to the formerly enslaved people as reparations, that land was then stolen from them, returned to the enslavers, and then those people were forced to work for them again, often not being paid, so working under conditions that didn't look that different from enslavement. It is this failure to recognize the moral demands of a history that exonerates white people from a sense of responsibility for that history and for that violence and horror. So I have been in communication with the people of the Pleasant Point plantation to correct at least their history, but also for them to think that they too are implicated in that moral demand and should take responsibility for the fact that Black people have been ethnically cleansed from this community and their history erased. And this is a history that we all have to take account of. Thank you. Let me pass it on to Jovan.
Hi everybody. Thank you, Professor Frankie, for that wonderful first presentation. Thank you to everybody who organized this series of events. And it's quite exciting that we have a series of events here over the next few weeks. And I'm really glad, to be a part of the first day and the first session. So I want to, follow on from Professor Frankie and also from Professor Scott's earlier comments, right? To think about the kind of 2 points of contention that often undergird the challenges faced by programs for reparation for the slavery of Africans throughout the Americas. Right? These programs and their underlying reparative claims are often hindered both materially, but more importantly, discursively by fixed ideas of blame. In other words, who's responsible and how or rather when to locate the injury that demands repair. So the question of the distance and our contemporary removal from the crime of slavery and those who participated in its perpetration. So I want to discuss this through, and this kind of the kind of basis for repair as felt and articulated by, three guys, Junior, Omar, and Dwayne, right, who formed a kind of scammer crew of Jamaican lottery scammers who I discuss in my book, Scammers Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica. The scam, just to quickly give an overview, is an intricate scheme that defrauds thousands of primarily elderly white Americans to send scammers in Jamaica what had often amounted to their life savings. Scammers mainly targeted vulnerable white American senior citizens, promising them various awards from cash to cars, right? But when I asked this crew of scammers how they could justify scamming these foreign elderly persons, they simply responded that they viewed their act as a form of reparations. So I'm going to go into further detail about that in my presentation next week and as a part of this series, where I want to hopefully discuss more about the kind of ethics and the rationalizations behind the scam. However, curious though, the crew's reparative claim was compelling because it actually had very little to do with the normative terms on which reparations are typically based. Rather than being situated within an argument about slavery, their ideas of reparations were explicitly a matter of contemporary concern. The contemporary poverty that they experienced and used, they used a scam to escape. It was a more meaningful and identifiable kind of basis for them than the injury of slavery. So the entire time that I was with the crew, I wondered, how they justified scamming these victims, right? And after directly inquiring one day about how they felt, one of the crew members, Omar, answered, I don't feel a way when we have so little and they have so much, and they still want more. So in his reference to them still wanting more, Omar, right, and for that matter, the entire crew, kind of seemed puzzled how victims, their victims had so much money to kind of give away. And that even as they gave away money, they did so in the with the intention of gaining more. So to them, their victims kind of, practiced and participated in a bizarre form of accumulation. How do you want more when you already have so much? But more importantly, what this kind of puzzle represented, was what Obika Gray called the disjuncture between the misery and hardship of Jamaicans' lived experience and the imagined experience of participating in the material well-being of America. So that disjuncture, right, the everyday circumstance of their poverty, was the outcome of several decades of Jamaican development efforts within the particular nexus of global capitalist economics and post-colonial politics. Since independence, the history of Jamaican political economy suggests that the country, has remained in a prolonged state of crisis, right? As Tony Bogues has said, right, a crisis in which economic relations, political ideas, and old patterns of domination and power have undergone wrenching convulsions. Every economic and political advance then, including independence in Jamaica, has in many ways been, a part of a kind of failure to reconcile the kind of nefarious and bad faith foundation, of its independence, of its emancipation. And so through such an arrangement and expectations, economic circumstances for the crew and for, urban poor Jamaicans generally, right, become an ordering principle for a general experience in which for them race, history, politics, and culture are used to create a framing, right, a way to demarcate relations and considerations, that kind of account for the capacity of the race poor more generally to kind of engage society and the terms under which they do so. In other words, their economic circumstances, their poverty, was understood within a kind of cosmological and even ontological sense. And Jamaicans had used this sense to kind of understand and organize their world. And there's a word for this in Jamaica, and that word is sufferation. And so sufferation, which I want to spend some time talking about today, because sufferation, in the argument that I make in Scammers Yard, is the foundation of this reparative claim. And so sufferation should be understood and seen as rooted in an ethically, culturally, and historically organization and articulation by which, the economic process and everyday life of Jamaicans are understood, right, as an experience of poverty. As Sylvia Winter has argued, right, something like sufferation is meant to actualize the category most totally condemned to poverty and joblessness, right? It is a failure of mastery over economic scarcity. Sufferation then is kind of at once a kind of spirit, has a spirit of forfeiture and acceptance. Sufferation is where success is unattainable yet knowable. And so therefore it produces a sense of longing. As such, the crew, right, was stuck in sufferations and mutable economics. It was a social and psychic condition. Perhaps it was ontological. And it was one where they were positioned as incapable of progress. It was for them the kind of immobility, right? To which, as Fanon has argued, the colonized subject is condemned. The impacts of sufferation are therefore felt across space, right? Through the arrested material development of Jamaica's economy. Sufferation is experienced as a lived spatialization of endemic poverty in Jamaica and the inequalities and adversities that cause it. It produces a scalar repercussion, right? That presents a kind of protracted state of crisis that is not just a crisis of the state, right? It is, also the kind of multiplication of everyday crises experienced with such regularity that their discreteness becomes indiscernible from the normative functioning of society. Sufferation is that experience, but it's also a means of identifying the way that this adversity functions in the kind of economic and social landscape. It's also a framework for reconciling that adversity. Right? So this process of identification and of reconciliation is underpinned by orienting ethical dispositions that engender a reading and understanding of the limitation of the resources available in that landscape. Subsequently, Jamaica becomes understood as full of potential, but also restricted opportunity. This opportunity is evidenced, right, in the presence of the wealth that exists in the circuits that bypass the poor with frustrating proximity. If we're thinking about the all-inclusive hotels, the cruise ships that are constantly coming into harbor, there is a sense, especially for the scammers who, many of whom had worked in the call center, being on the other line of somebody who's complaining that their same-day shipping from Amazon hadn't arrived on time. There's a sense in which wealth is just there, but is still unattainable. So for the crew, right, who understood, that for wealth to exist, right, and that for wealth to exist and for it to be just still out of reach, right, that there was a sense by which it operated through a kind of quality of opacity, right? To be socioeconomically immobile and unproductive for them was a kind of failure, right? But they understood that that failure was all but guaranteed when one operates per the normative notions of the economy, right? This functioning, right, it leads to, right, a sense of living within that economic opacity. However, where opacity makes up the circuits within which capital circulates, poverty is impenetrable, right? The circuits of capital, right, therefore create normalized senses of economic failure. And this view reflects a perception of the world in which the economy induces the simultaneous registers of belonging, right, but also being disqualified from the world. So for the crew, Jamaica, again, being full of potential and opportunity, which remains just out of reach, right? They decided not to accept those circumstances. And they took what they found as a necessary, albeit illegal way or step to kind of circumvent those circumstances. They determined that what was required to bring material prosperity to themselves and their family, right, wasn't just a mere act of political resistance, but it was a radical breaking of the quote unquote rules that had kept them poor and in sufferation. And indeed, in order to break those rules required an unruly counter-politics meant to undermine the expectation that participation in the global economy required compliance, right? Compliance based upon the exploitative terms that had long disadvantaged Jamaicans and Jamaica's position within the global political and economic relations, right? And weakens, their capacity for sovereign governance. And so, in this environment, all meaningful opportunities to raise themselves from poverty had proven fruitless. This is a fruitlessness that, having grown cynical, even dismissive of the promise of education and citizenship, applied to the broader promise of Jamaican independence, from which they were now a generation removed. They were not raised on the hope of increased political and economic prospects, symbolized by the failed Union Jack in 1962. But instead on the evaporation of that hope amidst the fulfillment of structural adjustment policies begun just over a decade later. This notion, if not a fact of failure then, right, fits centrally into their calculations of the world and their country's place within it. And so again, right, facing these circumstances, the crew chose to scam. And so to materialize their ambitions through this scam or through the con was effectively appropriate given their particular read of the world. To Junior, Mar, and Dwayne, the world that they lived in was bent, right? It wasn't broken, it was bent. And it was marked, right, by political and economic strictures that have long plagued Jamaica's development and still haunt the nation through the specter of structural adjustment. And so navigating contemporary Jamaica required them to look at the world askance and to maneuver within it accordingly. Their lives are situated within a post-colonial condition of Blackness, but framed by the post-structural adjustment period, or what might be termed, and as North Atlantic developed nations' contemporary experience of, quote, late liberalism. But this for them was a sense of sufferation that really had been in its development since the period of emancipation. So, what's important to note is that, their sense of their crime was not one produced by their own criminality, right? Nor by some kind of broader Jamaican, social pathology, but was explicitly the result of how modern capitalism functions in the region, right? The outcome of their trying so many different ways to make a living, right? Or what they would call to make life, suggested something else, something more, right? To be seen and understood, right? To attain success beyond the hustling and suffering, right? It was an astute intuitional assessment, right? And thus they required a new politics of vigilance, and they produced for themselves a new way of seeing. So, what was important for them, though, or was important for me in trying to understand their participation in the scam, was that, neither the social mores that produced the values of freedom and emancipation, nor the kind of principle of nationality or nationalism in the era of independence had secured for Junior, Omar, and Dwayne what was in many ways seen as, a promised sense of a sovereign post-colonial future. Indeed, right, with the turn away from the values of social welfare that had, served as a kind of imperative thrust towards independence, right? And instead toward a kind of new ethical regime disciplined by the US and IMF-induced privatization. The kind of possibility of that sovereign governance faded with the ascendance of a new post-colonial ethics in Jamaica, right? Beginning in the era which saw the overlapping of post-coloniality, right? Post-colonial independence and structural adjustment. After all, right, it could be said that so fleeting was the actual moment of post-colonial independence. So in the absence of the wealth and movement, right, which had been, perpetually elusive, right, and then furnished by the kind of conditions, right, by the kind of arrested development in Jamaica, right, which for them produced a sense of misery and immobility. Right, sufferation came to function as a kind of vernacular ethics around the economy that translated to a fundamental condition that was in need of repair. And thus they sought a kind of freedom, albeit not one from colonialism, but by the poverty left in its wake. These, young men then had, used the framework of their time, their formation, that of structural adjustment, by the way of the industries that it produced. Right? Again, they participated in call center work. I'll discuss that a little bit more next week, right? To liberate themselves. Just as the generation before them had sought freedom based on the kind of scaffolding of their time, that of the modern state-based nationalism. This generation of young Jamaicans, right, chose to glean their own independence by criminal means because the world was criminal. So gone was the collectivist ethos that had long contained the hope of the independence era, because despite their working, right, towards that endeavor, right? The crew members had realized that they could only have faith in their individual ambitions. And so responding to the circumstances with the scam, right, qualifies as what I would call a kind of turn toward a kind of post-colonial seizure. And in doing so, right, the crew and the scam subverts the ethical foundation of the post-colonial present. Independence, right, was no longer an issue of state sovereignty. It was no longer an issue of a collectivist movement, or what we might consider a collectivist notion of uplift. Independence for them was effectively monetary, right? And so therefore the ethics of seizure, the scam, was the shape of the world in which the crew lived, right? And within that wake, the contours of the space once occupied by visions of sovereignty and emancipation are now otherwise categorized. And thus through seizure, scammers exploit what we might see as a kind of long engagement, or Jamaica's long engagement with the kind of global order, where seizure finds its ethical virtue in the claims of the poor. And so what we have is then a turn towards a kind of radical ethics of seizure, a radical ethics of seizure that allows for a kind of radical claim making. And as a part of that radical claim making, we begin to see how scammers can look to North American white distant victims as a site and source for their reparation. Thank you. So Catherine, I think we have some things to talk about then. And I wanted to kind of start thinking, thinking from my presentation, and alongside yours, there's this notion of a kind of imperfect condition of emancipation that I think really holds our two kind of ideas together. And I hope that, perhaps you could say a little bit more, get us started by saying a little bit more about those imperfect conditions of emancipation. Especially the way that you make the distinction between the kind of the operation between, freedom, right? Or what we might consider as the subject of the freeman or the freedman, right? So how does freedom actually function in this moment, right? And how does the kind of operation of the kind of the letter D, actually signal the kind of imperfect condition of emancipation?
Thank you for asking that, and wow, thank you for your presentation. You and I have done this before, had this conversation before, and every time I hear you talk about your book, I learn more. So thank you so much. And as you know, I have your book, and I've really enjoyed reading it. I've learned so much from it. Coming from the vantage point of law. And being a legal scholar, although I like to see myself as an interdisciplinary scholar, so many lawmakers, lawyers, and the public think that law will save us. And so changing the legal status of a group of people is clearly isn't the entire work that needs to be done in these moments. And it's an over-reliance, I think, on law. And I kept thinking about what decolonization has meant for Jamaicans. And as you said, it was a very short-lived moment of delight at what lay on the other side of colonization. And so changing the legal status, whether it's in Jamaica or in the US South, it is only the beginning. It's certainly a necessary, but not a sufficient set of moves that need to be made in order to create real freedom for people in either of these contexts. And one of the things I argue in the book is that property can play an incredibly important role in rendering people not just freed, but actually free. And it may be, and I guess I want to tease this out with you a bit, it may be that claim is particular to the US context, or to the context of slavery. So I don't want to say this is universally the case, but for a group of people who were property, to then become property owners, to be sovereign themselves over land, was particularly important. And I think because the way that the role that property plays as what one might describe as a keystone right, not all rights, like contract, being able to sue or sue or be sued by others, having a kind of legal identity to mobilize the legal system, they're not all equal. Property plays a particularly critical role in the idea of personhood, that from which other rights, the status of bearing other rights, I think, flow. And so I argue in the book that the delivery of property as a form of repair for formerly enslaved people who were property was particularly appropriate in the US South then, and I think it remains appropriate now. And so the book ends with a recommendation that we increase the estate tax to seize seize money, which I believe is sort of held in trust by white people now, at a moment where we're in the midst of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer we've ever seen on this planet, from my parents' generation to mine, and seize that money, put it into a fund, and fund a number of things. But one of them would be community land trusts, to have property held collectively in Black communities that would result hopefully in both enrichment but also empowerment. So property, I think, can play an important role then, and it could play an important role now.
Yeah, thank you for that. And what's interesting is that in Scammers Yard, I didn't want to make too much of a claim for what the scammers were doing as being, a kind of model for reparations. But I couldn't help but see, so many so much, logical similarity, if you will, between your book and between your kind of model for repair, reparation, and what the scammers had kind of worked out for themselves. In other words, so you advance this kind of like wealth transfer, if we can call it that, right, by a certain segment of a kind of white North American population. Through, you're not asking for direct cash transfers, right? But meaning to say that that wealth can then do something that ultimately leads to a kind of, relationship to property, right? As modeled on these historical cases that you put forward. And so I kept thinking about that, and what the scammers had done, right, was with the money that they had gotten, they had effectively done something very similar. Right? They had gone out, they had bought land, they built houses, you know what I mean? And the idea was that they were creating a sense of intergenerational wealth for themselves. In fact, one of the scammers had said that he wanted his money to be old money, not new money. Right? He wanted, and what I understood him to, be trying to him to say, in that moment was he wanted to have, not only legitimacy, but he wanted to have the kind of, assurance, that his children and so forth would have this kind of wealth basis. And so what was interesting is that there was something that I could see in the scammer logic that in many ways kind of felt, kindred, if you will, to some aspects at least of your prescription. I didn't want to make a prescription, so to speak, because I understand, talking about offering reparations, specifically reparations. I'm happy for the book and for the scammers to advance a kind of formulary for repair. That's the point, as far as I'm concerned. But advancing a kind of prescription for reparations or something that I kind of stopped just short of. So what is interesting about the property thing, though, and you kind of gave yourself some room to kind of say, well, this is a U.S. case, a U.S. specific case here. But I couldn't help but thinking more about how the kind of moment of sovereignty, right, in Jamaica, right, after independence, felt very similar to kind of what we might think of the moment of sovereignty that the subjects in your book have, right? There's a fleeting moment, right, where there's autonomy, there's independence, there's a kind of sovereign, and I know it was compromised, right? Between your two cases, there are different degrees of each group's, right to exercise these things, but there's a question about the fleeting, the kind of fleeting thing that brings me still back to the question of the imperfect condition of emancipation. Because, you have a quote in the book where you say that like the kind of future that would have been made possible had formerly enslaved people been emancipated with both rights and resources, rather than merely with limited rights, would likely have produced a quite different, more just and less unequal present, right? And there's a speculative component to it, but it's not purely speculative, right? I mean, because what we see, and what I try to at least argue with the question of sufferation is that there's an intentional process behind that, right? Just enough, giving just enough freedom that, enables a kind of continuation of the productivity of the formerly enslaved, right? You have just enough liberty, but you are still constricted, right? And this is what Sylvia Winter and Fanon and so forth go on to kind of call the kind of the colonized dilemma. But there's just, just so much freedom that's being offered. And I think, the same can be said of the kind of post-independence moment. So I just thought, it was really brilliant to kind of think across these cases in a way, because what we're seeing is a kind of more generalized order of subjugation, right? In which economics and politics, rooted in what we might consider a kind of white supremacist logic, thinks about freedom, thinks about emancipation in similar ways.
Yeah. I wanted to provoke you to return to this idea of sufferation, which is so, I think, productive. And in some ways, you've offered, at least in your presentation, a kind of moral economy of how the term slavery went was mobilized by the crew. But I'm wondering if you could also offer us an affective reading of the scam, of framing the scam as reparations, of the feeling of freedom, or the feeling of freedom being just beyond your grasp. You use terms like disappointment and longing. And I'm wondering what an affective reading of all of these particular terms and contexts would look like for the subjects that you know so well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So I think it's the introduction. I talk about, spending time in the yard, the kind of neighborhood, the kind of, public area of the scammer crew's neighborhood and near their homes, and spending time with them as they wait for these remittances to kind of come in, the kind of paydays from their victims to come in. And what struck me was just how often, right, when things weren't really going well, how often the scam crew members would kiss their teeth, and as a kind of like artifact of affect, if you will, that practice, what it showed, right, was this constant contemplation and meditation on the limits of their abilities, the kind of limitations that they lived within, and the frustration, right? Just the sheer frustration. And, again, this idea of longing, in Montego Bay, where the work is based, there's a constant influx of beyond just the kind of cultural influence that is, Americana through popular media and so forth. There are literal Americans all over the place, right? But they themselves are also there, but just beyond reach, right? They're kind of cordoned off in the kind of closed circuits of the all-inclusive, or of the cruise ship excursion thing, right? Where, the capital is there, but it's just beyond reach. And so there was so much about the kind of lived experience for these guys, and for, poor Jamaicans who largely, in Montego Bay, who largely participate in the tourist economy, where they're seeing wealth all of the time, right? And this is only, doubled down on when the call centers arrived in Jamaica, right? As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, being on the phone line, with a customer in North America who's complaining about some kind of thing, and demonstrating their wealth. So, there is a feeling of as I say, I think I said it, frustrating proximity. Right. And that's the feeling, in the book, I think it was Junior, one of the guys, says like, look, I'm a youth with intelligence. You know what I mean? Like, I'm smart. I know I can, like, I know I can do things. Why can't Jamaica, right? Why can't Jamaica provide for me? Why can't Jamaica catalyze my capabilities and my potential? And so that changes, right, with the scam, or rather, through the proceeds from the scam. What we see, or what I saw, right? And this is also kind of thinking about a particular moment in the scam's history, because we can, the scam, has a pretty sad ending, sad ending as far as, criminal enterprises go. But, for the moment, the scam refashioned the relationship that these young men had to their country. Right, because they had breached the opacity, they had breached the impenetrability of capital, right? They were able to have things in Jamaica that they thought, beforehand they had to go, abroad to acquire. They had houses, they had cars, they had land. They were able to educate they were able to educate their children, right? In many ways, their kind of kinship relations became much more positive, right? No one was quarreling about how to pay the light bill, these kinds of things. And so, the kind of sense of aspiration is affective here, right? And the satisfaction of that aspiration ultimately became, what I would argue as the kind of basis for a sense, a sense and a sentiment of repair.
Yeah. So this is interesting that it enabled a new relationship with their country, you say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the things that I found so interesting in comparing the work that I've been doing with the work that you've been doing is the reparations project that I look at is one that was enabled by the state. The state seizes land, then doles it out, then takes it back.
Right.
The state is a big player in the idea of reparations, even though they are responding to a demand made by the intended beneficiaries of that reparations project. Today, I think there's a pretty strong feeling that the state should play a key role in reparations in the United States. But until it does, we have a lot of reparative projects going on outside the state, universities, churches,
right.
other communities kind of coming to terms and doing their own kind of ad hoc reparative projects. And with your study, it's absolutely reparations outside the state.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They are, as you say, unruly and breaking the rules. And that's part of what's great about it, I think. And there must be some sense of sort of revenge and delight that they're able to think it up and get away with it. Right. And the state, not until the end of the book does the state kind of catch up with them. So and then you say it allows them to reimagine their relationship with their country. So the state comes in as part of the sort of reparative result or symptom, maybe even of what they're doing. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the meaning and what work gets done got done in the context that you've written about in Jamaica for the crew, that it did not involve the state affirmatively as a partner. In a way, individuals taking on their own form of structural adjustment that normally we think of state-like actors like the World Bank or nation states to do. Now, maybe country means something different than the state, and that would be worth pressing.
Yeah, and I think it does. It does actually, and I think so. There are a few things. What's interesting is that so the scam begins to emerge while alongside the development of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So what's fascinating is that you have, and for me, what's really productive analytically is that I have, a kind of side-by-side or the ability to make a side-by-side analysis, by which I'm able to see, okay, well, what is a kind of formal, reparative program doing? What kind of claims are they making? What are they seeking? And compare that with these scammers who are making a reparative claim kind of retroactively in this radical kind of way. And what we see is the limitations of state actors, right? We see the negotiations that the state has to become party to, and I talk about that in the book through a kind of framework of what I call like post-colonial reciprocity, right? So freedom and unfreedom are often negotiated through a kind of mutual commitment, an ongoing mutual commitment between former colonizers and the formerly colonized. In other words, the Jamaican state, in order to in seeking and in attaining its legitimacy, has to still, be party to, some kind of normative political order, right? Which allows their former colonizers to kind of get away with some things, right? And we see that independence, for example, if emancipation was compromised, we see that independence was compromised. And the reason why it was kind of put up with is because there was a mutual dependence that somehow was unwilling to be broken with. And so the state as that, right, is seen as not really ever capable of providing meaningful repair. Right. I think you do a wonderful job in the book of showing the kind of various freedoms that were given through legislation and again, the limitations of their provisioning. Right. So the scammers then, come up, in a country you're right, in a country in which the state is unreliable, right? The state is unreliable because the state itself is beholden to a set of circumstances that are not of its own making. And so you cannot rely upon the state because the state is beholden, right, to larger, broader actors and circuits, right? I mean, we can think about structural adjustment as being perfectly symbolic of that. You know, we can think about the stunting of Jamaica's agricultural sector, right, during this period, right, to accommodate, you know, the kind of foreign agricultural industries in the United States, for example. So the state cannot be relied upon. And so, you know, repair, at least repair, if not reparation, then has to be sought on one's own terms and through, you know, one's own enterprise, because everything else, you know, everything else has been gotten that way, you know, effectively.
Right. You know, one thing that's interesting revisiting the history in the Sea Islands and in Mississippi is the initial demand was not to be brought within the arms of the state. It was to have the state retreat.
Right. Right.
We don't want you here. And the Sherman land grants, you know, the 40 acres and a mule that everyone in the US is so familiar with, also contained this provision that you'll get the land and white people have to leave. But it wasn't, I don't think it was thought as a permanent condition, but just for a little bit, you know, for a little bit. And, you know, one way to understand the emplotment that followed the end of the Civil War and the idea of the 14th Amendment, that one of the most fundamental things it did was grant citizenship, US citizenship, to all of the formerly enslaved people, thus fixing the Dred Scott problem. Right. Is that it's, you know, it's interesting to think that actually the folks that were enfranchised through the 14th Amendment were not asked whether they wanted to be citizens, right, by and large. It was understood that this was an unambiguous good. And, you know, another perhaps less white supremacist way of thinking it is that citizenship itself was an injury. It was another form, right, of continuing violence by the state, by the US state. And that had we thought or taken more care and listened better at the time, autonomous communities for Black people without the US state presence, perhaps paired with Native people and their demands for sovereignty and independence, might have been a better way to go. So I do think a lot about the role of the state as a broker in enabling freedom, but doing so on terms that produce their own new forms of unfreedom always. And certainly the Jamaican example, I think, illustrates that as well.
That's exactly right. No, thank you so much, Catherine. I think we are being asked to go to Q&A. Yeah. Is that right, Anna?
Yes, hello, hi.
Hi, Jim.
Dr. Frankie, Dr. Scott Lewis, thank you so much for giving us all an opportunity to learn more about your work and to listen in on this interesting conversation between the two of you. So there are a number of questions lining up in the Q&A, and we'll get to them right away. I've also received a few questions from the back door. I'll start with one of them, and then I'll move over to some of the questions that we received in the Q&A. So one of the ones that I have here says, and this is aimed for the two of you. Your respective books approach the subject of reparations and repair in very different ways. Frankie, focusing on radical utopian history of Black communities in the US, you make a case for reparations program structured around property ownership. Lewis, in your work, you focus on how ideas of reparations circulate as a discourse in informal criminalized networks in Jamaica. What do you think these different approaches to the subject of repair and reparations can tell us about reparatory justice, studies of reparatory justice more broadly today?
Jovan, you want to go first?
Sure, I don't mind. The informality is correct. And I think, that is I think part of the part of the lesson or part of the offering towards, thinking about the kind of framework of reparatory justice, what the scammer experience showed me, right? And Anna, in your introduction, you talked about the distinction between repair and reparation. And quite, there have been folks who've begun thinking about this. David Scott, right? Catherine, Deborah Thomas have been thinking about these distinctions. And I think what we need to actually, do, whether collectively or throughout our own, advocacy, is to actually push, deeper consideration about the distinction between these two terms. Because, what repair to me means, as rooted in the kind of work that I did with the lottery scammers in Jamaica, was about this kind of this satisfaction, right? I think, Catherine, in your book, you called it something like like a make whole remedy, right? And the question of being made whole, I think the scammers argued, was really up to the individual. It was about, how do I feel whole as an individual? Because, right, and we can see this in the North American context as well, blackness, while a kind of collective phenomenon, is in fact, articulated through individual presence, right? One, as an individual person, feels the collective injury of blackness, right? One, as an individual, is constantly, at threat for the kind of collective problem that is blackness, right? And so for me, what the informality and the kind of radical approach to thinking about repair, offers is a real challenge to start thinking about the scope of that satisfaction. And I think it is a challenge, right? It is very difficult. But what the response is about rethinking the politics of collectivism, right? How do we disrupt the notion of community, of blackness as a community or a collective form, when we're thinking about what reparations looks like? Well, we do that by thinking about what repair means. And to me, that's an important starting place, and it falls in line with, I think, the prescriptions that so many of you have been offering, right, in thinking about the distinction between repair and reparation. Because, if we don't do that, right, and Catherine's book has demonstrated this perfectly, then reparation will be like any other policy in the past, right? It would be one other means of trying to accommodate this kind of collectivist sense, which in no uncertain terms would be, compromised. And what does it mean to be the recipient of reparation without feeling repaired? That, to me, would open up a whole new set of questions and problems. The major problem would be that if one has reparation but doesn't feel repaired, does that then disqualify any further claim of injury? That, to me, is a real problem.
Well, and that goes to Dr. Scott's opening of some ruptures are never repairable. We can't replay the tape, as he said, but that doesn't excuse us from undertaking the project. I don't think that was his intent. I think part of what this history tells us today, if that's part of your question, so often people think of reparations as a modern notion, too radical for the present, certainly way too radical for the past. We didn't do it then, so why would we do it now? And I think part of the historical record teaches us is that it was not too radical then. People actually used the terms reparations in thinking about how we had to address a fuller and more complete form of emancipation. And white people were with the program. People understood it. Now, the white people administering the program were not the white people who were paying the price of having their land not returned to them, but there were plenty of respectable white leaders in Washington and in the South who understood that reparations were not just possible but necessary. And so in that sense, I find this history very compelling for us to remember that, or to learn it for the first time, which is the case for most people. The other piece that I think is really important is that our focus should not be only on who gets reparations and why, but from whom. And in so many respects, I wrote this book for white people to look at this history and know that they can't look away from it, that it's our responsibility as white people to take this on and to recognize the moral demand made by the history, and to disgorge some of the benefits of whiteness that we have enjoyed in a way that has been always structured around innocence, almost always. And so to the extent that you have members of Congress saying, well, that was a long time ago, or, I hear all the time, well, my family didn't live here and enslave anybody. Why should I have to pay? These histories, I think, engage a very different way of thinking about responsibility and obligation for the whole society to accomplish the kind of reparations that were begun furtively and then withdrawn in the immediate post-war period.
Thank you for that. We'll go on, and I think I'll try to go through two questions in one. They are quite different in kind, but nevertheless, I think there is especially something about the question of the contemporary that's overlapping that we can bring together. So Hugh McGuire says, one can never change the past or make adequate reparations for it, but we can change the present. Wouldn't reparations efforts be better directed on eliminating today's racism, inequities, and inequalities? And then another one I would loop in here is Chris Watson, who asks, I would love to hear commentary on the ADOS movement and their arguments that the American government should make reparations only to American descendants of American enslavement. So, and ADOS, for those that don't know, is what is it, an acronym for African Descendants of Slaves in the US. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you began the first question with, you can't change the past, but you can change the present or the future. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. The past is an actively constructed fact. It's not a settled fact. And part of telling these stories again is for us to have a different conception of the truth of the past than the one that I think most of us in the US are taught in school when we're kids. And so I think that I turn to Paul St. Amour's work, literary theorist, on the idea of re-emplotment of the past, of possible futures that were extinguished at some point, but we can return back to those possible futures and replot the present through actions we take today that are responsive to that past and maybe a new knowing of that past. So I find Paul's work really helpful in that respect. And then I just would call implementing racial justice measures today reparations. And I think that's an important distinction. Reparations are designed to address a particular kind of human rights atrocity or rupture. That's different from creating a minimally just society. Any society should have measures that secure certain forms of racial, sexual, economic, et cetera, justice. And one need not have had the horror of slavery in order to make a demand in the present that we implement a shared value, either through law or otherwise, of racial justice today. So I often want to resist the idea of reparations having to take care of everything. I don't think it does. I think it needs to address a particular kind of injury and past. And then we also have this other work to do. So that's what I would say about that. In terms of ADOS, they take a very different position than INCOBRA does and some of the other groups that have been working in the Black community for a very long time in the US on thinking about reparations. I think limiting reparations only to the genetic descendants of enslaved people is thinking too small. I don't want to ignore those people, certainly. But first of all, most Black people in this country can't trace their genetic lineage anyway. So as a practical matter, it would be almost impossible to do in a way that would capture who in fact are the genetic descendants of enslaved people. But the badge of inferiority that is Blackness, as Jovan was saying earlier, it was the enabling condition for slavery in the first place. And so I think that limiting reparations only to formerly enslaved people without addressing what white supremacy does in terms of mobilizing anti-Blackness across a range of times is to think too small about reparations.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you, you know, on the question of ADOS, you know, and even the acronym, the, you know, American Descendants of Slaves, right? It's, to me, it speaks to a kind of troubling kind of property logic, right? Which kind of, as I write, and I think in the book, you know, but not about ADOS specifically, but just about these kinds of political and geographic designations of who owes whom. You know, it reinscribes a kind of colonial property logics, right? And it also obscures the truly global functioning of slavery. You know, it was an interconnected web of economic activity, you know, in which, you know, there was mobility of enslaved persons through the Caribbean and North America, you know, and so there isn't a clean, you know, a neat lineage of slavery, even beyond the kind of genetic claim. You know, so for example, you know, speaking genetically, you know, Jamaicans and, you know, some of the early, who we know as Jamaicans today, of African descended Jamaicans, and a good portion of the Black population, you know, of the Virginia colony, right, we're all part of the same Igbo, you know, Igbo people, right? And in many ways, like, how does that not trouble this logic, right? So I think, you know, what Catherine says is that, you know, we need to make a bigger claim. We need to be actually more ambitious. The scammers speak to that, and the scammers, I think, you know, demonstrate, you know, a kind of opening, really an explosion, if you will, of the kind of normative limitations by which we assign blame. And they get at, you know, this issue of the kind of the circuitry and the circulation by which, you know, these debts have operated historically. You know, it's a, you know, to me, you know, it would be a sad thing to kind of, you know, recategorize, you know what I mean, on really stark colonial bases, you know, which Black people belong to, you know, to which colonial regimes. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? You know, the first question, you know, Catherine's exactly right. You know, we can't, you know, we can't assume that events have passed, right? And we see this, you know, in the lived experience of Black people. Really across the Americas, there is a constant recollection, there's a constant invocation, you know, of you know, previous moments, right? Jim Crow, right? Of the days of slavery. Burning Spear, the Jamaican artist, you know, had a very wonderful song back in the 70s where he asked, do you remember the days of slavery? And, you know, the question wasn't really a rhetorical one, in a way that it was like, well, yes, of course we do, because we're living, right? We're living within that still. You know, Deb Thomas talks about the simultaneity of the plantation. You know, so this is a known experience, right? Now, you know, what is important is that, you know, we're talking about reparations for slavery. We can also be talking about reparations for Jim Crow. We can be talking about reparations for mass incarceration. We can be making multiple claims or multiple reparatory claims simultaneously. And I think, you know, as Catherine put it perfectly, I really don't have much to add to the argument that you make, right, Catherine, or your response, is that we can't think of reparations as a catch-all, right? I think, you know, Catherine, that's what you referred to, kind of like freedom on the cheap or something like that, wasn't it? Something along those lines. But it is, I think I was being cheeky one day and I called it online, like, you know, freedom on layaway or something. And, you know, for those of you who remember layaway and Kmart, you know, so the idea is that there's a multiplicity of claims that can be made. And we have to be, you know, more precise about you know, those claims, and or at least making those claims. and resist, a kind of blanketed approach, because what we do deserve, right, or what all citizens of the United States, as a specific example, deserve, have been the kind of regular and in many ways uncontroversial, advantages of citizenship. And those simply have not been paid out. And so reparations for slavery, the injury of slavery, cannot be seen as accommodating that injury, as well as satisfying, right, what is a normative expectation that arrives out of the 14th and 15th Amendment, right? And these are two discrete issues.
Thank you for that. I have a few questions coming in. Dr. Frankie, there's one for you, and Jovan, there are two for you. I'll read the first, and then I'll call on Emil W. to speak on their question afterwards. Dr. Frankie, one question from Saira Simone asks, I'm curious to hear how Point Pleasant Plantation has responded to your work. And Jovan, I'll just get to yours. Alexander Albero says, Jovan, super interesting, thanks. My question is, how well would the traffic in narcotics fit into the radical ethics of seizure and claim making that you summon? Yeah. So
the people of Pleasant Point Plantation are not particularly excited about engaging this history and taking any responsibility for it. They are open to changing that history page and adding a little bit more about the history of slavery, but they do not want to see themselves implicated in it. The other thing I'm doing in that area, though, is writing a curriculum for middle and high schoolers on the history of the Sea Islands and of other areas in South Carolina. And that's coming along quite well. And part of what I'm also aim to teach the kids is how to do archival research for them to learn their own stories, their own family and community stories. It's like a treasure hunt. Anybody that's done archival work, it's fantastically fun and exciting and devastating, and all of that. And seeing that history in real pieces of paper is just wonderful. And so having kids get excited about their own histories is a wonderful thing. So the children are actually much more interested in the people in that retirement community in Pleasant Point, not surprisingly.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because I've tried, so with Scammers Yard, right? The scammers are criminals, right? But I've tried to carefully think about what criminality means in this case and in the context. The one issue is that they read the kind of general condition and practice of capitalism, Western capitalism to be more precise, as a form of criminality. They see their poverty as not only a consequence, but a material functionality of that criminality. So they see themselves as being victims, right, to what we might consider a kind of normal capitalist order, right? So thinking about the kind of scale of criminality was one thing that I had to kind of be very, very attentive to, right? And what makes, so again, the question is, can something like traffic in narcotics fit the radical ethics of seizure and claim making that I summon, right? Now, what we see is that there is a need for, or what the scammers do is they have a very sophisticated, but I think effective, logic that identifies both historically and in a kind of contemporary and practice-based way, the blame that can be carried by white North Americans. And so while we may think, well, and this goes kind of back to the ADOS question earlier, right? So while we may think, well, the British, right, enslaved Africans and made them work the plantations. The truth is that, the Spanish had done so just before, right? But after that, right, in many ways, North America, the United States, has been seen as inheriting, the kind of, practice of injury from the British. And so in a way, there's a very orderly tracing of blame across these actors. And so, or at least there's an argument to be made that advances a kind of orderly tracing. So it's less about the kind of illegal activity of the crime, right? And more so how the scammers have identified the kind of subjects that they choose to victimize as a part of their kind of reparative formulary. Now, the scam itself then as a practice to kind of facilitate that is quite unique, because there is like a direct wealth transfer, right? And so whereas I've gone I've gone to great extents to not try and make a kind of reparations model off of this, what we see is that in the scam, right, there is something relatively legitimate if you look at some of the kind of the breadth of the programs that suggest something like wealth transfer, for example, for reparations. So there's something in the scam that actually feels like, or reads like a legitimate form of reparative process, right? I was very tempted, for example, in the book to kind of go through the remittance network and think about and like try to offer remittance as a formation of, paying reparations. I was like, let me just stop, right? I don't want to go too far. But, so what I say all of that to kind of make a distinction between what the scam is as a criminal act and what we might think of as other acts of criminality, right? Like the drugs trade. Now, what's important is that I make that distinction in Jamaica as well, because the scammers, right, are, at least for a time, very distinct from those who participate in the drugs and guns trade in Jamaica, right? The guns and drugs trade in Jamaica, interestingly, are very, very, very much part of the kind of political state order, right? So even going back to Catherine's earlier question about reparations and this whole thing and the role of the state, right? The state functions in Jamaica largely, through their partnership, with criminal actors like drug dons and so forth. And so, I think there should be grounds for making a distinction. Even in the book, I try and make a distinction between the scam as a criminal act and this, conventional, historical, and well-resourced and documented practice of narcotics trading, right? With that being said, what I said earlier about the individual carrying the injury and thinking radically about who and how one is able to make a claim of repair, right? That, to my mind, from a kind of ethical standpoint, and not necessarily like a logistical or logical standpoint, but an ethical standpoint, means that any criminal act, right, can ultimately be seen as having a kind of reparative basis, right? I like to think about the kind of everyday examples where, hypothetical, there's a Black kid who steals a candy from a candy shop and says, what is reparations, right? Like, I've actually heard that kind of language, right? Growing up in South Florida, I've heard that kind of language. And there's something truthful about that, right? There's something about it that we have to actually pay attention to, right? That youth who's stealing a candy and saying is reparations is living within a kind of a kind of circuit of debt, right? That youth lives knowing that he or she or they are owed something, right? They are owed something because of the condition of their Blackness. So I would fit more so the question of narcotics alongside that truly radical, and something that I'm not trying to account for really right now, in my answer, but something truly radical in that way, in which the kind of claim making process is one that can in fact resist a kind of ordering. We can look to what happens in Nigeria, for example, where oil pirates, right, are targeting Shell and so forth, and they target that, right? They may not be calling it reparations, but they're targeting these corporations because they understand that Shell is a part of the kind of post-colonial present that in many ways has hindered their own economic development, or is one of many parties who have hindered their economic development. So yeah, so in a way, there's a claim making process that is open, and that should be kind of taken seriously if there are some grounds to take it seriously. But for the scammers, it's a very unique case in which the means of reparative transfer, as well as the tracing of responsible parties, is done in a historical way that I think is actually more convincing than not.
Can I jump in for just a second on this issue? Because as I was reading your book, or have read your book several times, of course, I focused on the supposed criminality of it, and I kept thinking, yeah, and slavery was not criminal.
Right.
Slavery, it was not a crime to enslave people in the United States, and so the portability of the idea of the criminal and what populations become criminalized. As I read the book, I wanted to bring Robert Cover's work to bear, and he's probably a legal scholar that you're not familiar with, but he, in two articles, most notably Violence and the Word, he wrote about the jurisπathic and jurisgenerative qualities of law, and that law and legal regulation bring certain worlds into possibility, jurisgenerative, and extinguish the possibility of other worlds, jurisπathic. And the interesting thing about law's power to do both is that we want the law to do both. We expect it to do both. We can't have it all. And so because meaning is a scarce concept, the possibility of what lives, what forms of living become possible in any particular society are governed so thickly through law. And I kept thinking that the business model of your crew is criminalized, yet that business model looks like an awful lot of the legitimate businesses that we encounter every day that are quite legal and quite profitable. And so we have the jurisπathic arm of the law in Jamaica and the jurisgenerative arm of the law in other more legitimate business practices, but they're doing pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I wish I had that reference for chapter 3 of the book, where I try to think about that, right? And the fact that one of the only guys to be extradited and charged, wasn't even a scammer per se, meaning he wasn't picking up the phone and calling people, but rather he was selling the data, of who would become victims, right? And his argument throughout his case, throughout his trial was, listen, I bought many of these leads legally. I am just another, middleman or intermediary between the kind of, provider and purchaser of this information. So that's exactly right. And criminality, the portability of criminality is exactly right. But the ability to make the claim, here feels, thinking about jurisprudence then is a question of intent, and how do we criminalize intent, or how is intent actually at the heart of our criminal designations or designations of criminality?
I might just jump in here because I see time is ticking. We have about 10 minutes left.
All right.
And there are 3 questions here, and then I know Emil W. would go live to ask theirs. Dr. Frankie, I'll ask you just one question that I have here, and then Jovan, I'll ask one that come in from Dr. Imler, and then I'll read up a longer one here. So hopefully we can pull them together, and then we'll wrap up in time. So someone here says, Frankie, Dr. Frankie, your argument rests quite solidly around property rights. But property rights and titles to land are one of the primary ways in which indigenous sovereignty is denied in the United States. How do you see your work in the context of demands for native sovereignty? So that's one. And then Jovan, I'll scoop over here and see Dr. Imler says, great talks. For Jovan, I would be curious to what extent the distinction made between self-repair within communities and external repair by others like the state is productive in your view. Okay, and then on to a longer one that's come in from South Africa. Talia Lubinski says, thank you for these presentations. I'd like to bring back the comments made by Dr. Scott at the beginning of this conversation about the impossibility, but also necessity of reparative justice. I get that both models put forward by each of the presenters are presenting imperfect modes of repair and the limitations thereof. As a white South African, I am well acquainted with the liberal shortfalls of reconciliation as repair. My question is, and maybe the question of this whole series, is how to hold these inadequacies and urgent necessities together at once. I wonder whether we would actually want to loop in Emil W. now. Emil, are you here with us?
Hi, I'm here.
Okay, excellent. Do you want to pose your question as well?
Yeah, my question was for Jovan, and I'm from Trinidad, but I listen to a lot of dancehall music, and a song that really got my attention was Vybz Kartel song on reparations, and I wanted to know your thoughts on like how it was received by the Jamaican public, and the fact that it was actually banned on Jamaican airwaves. So like the reception of the public and then the response of the government to ban a song like that from the airwaves.
Thank you, Emil.
You want to go first, Jovan?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take them in reverse order just quickly, because I think so I talk a lot actually about the Cartel song in the book, largely because it was a direct inspiration, I think, for many of the crew members to kind of advance a reparative claim around what the scam was doing. So the song's chorus goes something like, they call it scam, but we call it reparations, right? Every ghetto youth is a star, so they want to live like one, something along those lines. The banning of the song, was quite expected. The message, was in fact supporting, and one might have argued inducing, criminal activity, in the country. So, the fact that it was banned wasn't surprising at all. What I want to say is that, there was a lot of music, kind of involved at the time. And so Vybz Kartel was certainly, influential. But I want to say that people like, American hip hop artist Rick Ross, for example, were especially influential, because they gave a sense, or he and other music like his gave a sense of what the crime should produce at the end of it, right? So there was a sense of aspiration, of ambition, of accomplishment that really helped to motivate the scammers. And so when you think about this idea, and then a kind of framework for reparations being advanced by Vybz Kartel, then what you see in fact is, this kind of material accomplishment, accumulation, we might just call it, to be more direct, as being a source or a form of repair. And that's basically what happened. The question about it being banned and like the community response, what I did as part of my research was I wanted to understand exactly how the kind of Jamaican society and some of the community members were responding to the scam itself. And so what I did was I went back and I read through, all of at least the Gleaner online articles about the scam, and I went and I scoured the comments section of each article. And what I saw was that there was quite a bit of, not support for the scam, but there was a fair amount of derision, and criticism for the victims, actually, because, they were seen as being gullible, or they were seen as being greedy. And so in a way, the kind of banning of the song, was less an issue of the community's feelings about the scam, and more so about Jamaica, participating in its, already very expected respectability politics, right? Jamaica's a very conservative nation by, when we start thinking about these formal kind of areas of the society, like the state. The question about self-repair, from Nicole, there's something in that question that that goes back to the conversation between Professor Frankie and I earlier, about the distinction between the country and the state, right? And the inability for the state to, not only, provide everyday kind of forms of sustenance, but even less so, a kind of basis for repair. And so, self-repair, is the necessary approach, at least as it stands, given Jamaica's current, political economic circumstances. So yeah, so I will give you. Okay, there's a comment from Catherine.
No, that's me. I was answering the question so you could fully answer the great questions you got.
No. So I just wanted to answer those two questions so you can answer yours, so then we can answer the third question from South Africa together. So go ahead, Catherine.
Well, I don't want to restate what I said in the comment, but just that today there are parallel tracks of reparations being demanded, both by Black people and by Native people. And that was true in the 1860s as well. And what's really curious about it is that Black people wanted something that the Native people ended up getting, and the Native people wanted something that the Black people ended up getting in some sort of meta way. And that was not a mistake. So the South African question, remind me, we've got 2 minutes, so remind me what was we were
the impossibility of reparative justice. The question is how to hold the inadequacies and urgent necessities together.
Well, I think reparative justice is always necessarily incomplete. Whether it happens immediately after the so-called injury or generations later, as Dr. Scott said, you can't unring the bell. You can't. So much of those injuries are about constructing or an expression of the power that constructs certain populations, and those structures remain. And so the repair is always taking place within the also unfinished project of dismantling those structures, whether it's colonialism or racism or white supremacy. That would be my very quick answer. But boy, you know better than I do in South Africa about the limits of repair.
Yeah, and I think, the issue of coming to terms with the impossibility or the incompleteness, is one of reconciling the kind of subject group subject terms of identification. And I say this specifically from within what we might consider the kind of Du Boisian argument for Blackness as being understood by a sense of shared suffering. And that really, was the kind of undergirding issue with my statement earlier, right, about repair and reparation. Because, what's at stake is not just simply if one feels satisfied or not, but the kind of definitional bases by which a group understands themselves after that fact, right? And so to me, we can't unring the bell, we can't rewind the tape, right? But there's a reality by which the tape continues to play, and the problem is, like, what tune is it playing right after this event, of reparation? And that's why I think, following Deborah Thomas, who asked us to kind of move away from thinking of reparations as an event, and rather, right, as a kind of process for thinking, right? How do we go about creating, new terms and new modes of recognition, for ourselves? And in a way, this goes to Nicole's question, of ourselves, but also of each other, because what that requires, is actually new terms of recognition, new terms of identifying who we are, terms beyond the citizen, because the notion of citizen is now corrupt, right? And it is perhaps irredeemable. And so that's what it requires. And until we do that, then everything else will, anything else will actually, fail to feel anything but incomplete, right? And the prospects of, satisfaction will, of course, forever be impossible.
All right, I know I'm conscious that we reached 3 p.m. and I know, Dr. Frankie, you will have to leave. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen in on the two of you. Howie, do you want to chime in with a few last words?
Yeah, sure. Just to repeat that, thank you so much for coming and for being here. I've really appreciated it. So I just want to remind everyone that the event has been recorded and it will be available on the Heyman YouTube channel. So we'll be back here next week with a panel entitled Reparations on a Global Scale with Ahmed Reed, Vasuki Nessia, and Ralph Wild, and Keston Perry will be the discussant. So that's Monday, the 22nd of March, and that will be the same link and the same time. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to David, who is no longer here. And do feel free to send any questions, any further questions that you might have to the panelists or to us at opir2020, so opir2020@gmail.com.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr.
everyone.
Frankie. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye. See you next week.